Setup and payoff are an essential duo in storytelling. It's a simple concept. Because X happened, therefore Y happens. However, when watching Ghostbusters Frozen Empire, I was reminded of the fact that setup does not equal payoff. And when this duo is misused, it can result in viewers feeling as disconnected from the story as payoff without any setup. I had a rough idea for this video when I finished watching the movie. It solidified when watching, shortly before Halloween, Phineas and Ferb, Night of the Living Pharmacists. In this, there was one moment in particular that, just like when watching Ghostbusters, I saw precisely how it was set up and how it paid off, but I didn't have the same reaction. It got me thinking, what made one work where the other didn't? To find out, let me tell you specifically what sparked the thought in both pieces. Ghostbusters, Frozen Empire. In Ghostbusters, there was one character in particular whose story's setup and payoff had a problem, though the thought certainly applies to other parts of the film as well. The specific character was Nadim. Nadim was born with the power to control fire. Very useful when your enemy's weakness is fire, might I add. He just hadn't apparently ever noticed it before. Throughout his entire life, he had never noticed that when angry, his power amplifies nearby flames. Because, you see, he needed an undeveloped power to raise the story's stakes. But I digress. When this power is discovered by the Ghostbusters, and its usefulness quickly realized, he begins training the power. He practices to little success, for the short period until the antagonist arrives. The antagonist, Garaka, begins battling the Ghostbusters, clearly holding the upper hand. Then, as all seems lost, the Ghost Lady, Melody, throws her last match. Another aspect of the story's setup and payoff misuse that I could have emphasized in this video, and will mention a little more later. She throws her last match, and wham! Nadim has learned how to control it, and he turns the tide in the favor of the Ghostbusters. The Ghostbusters defeat Garaka and enjoy a swell of public support, allowing them to continue on. Phineas and Ferb, Night of the Living Pharmacists.
What's the emergency?
Pharmacists! Pharmacists!
What does that even mean?
In part 1 of this episode, the friends rubberize themselves and begin bouncing around town, just as playful and creative as they always are. Dr. Doofenshmirtz's evil plan to take over the tri-state area, as usual, fails. This time, turning the mayor into a pharmacist that spreads its pharmacistness through static electricity. The friends are in the city when this happens, and one is touched, but wasn't affected due to their rubberized body. The kids are able to return home safely and eventually defeat the pharmacistification. Pharmacistification. There we go. So, for some reason, even though both solutions were clearly created with similar intentions, both were certainly created when writers were working and faced a problem of their own creation. How to defeat Garaka or grant protection from pharmacistification. One worked where the other didn't. And it comes down to how setup and payoff were used. Setup begins before you hit play or crack open a book. Setup happens the moment the medium for the story is chosen. Each medium has different rules. A superhero flick can have people flying across a room and giving up as if nothing happened. A horror film can let it take 20 seconds for someone to walk 3 feet and open a door. A cartoon can let young kids build, in just a few hours, a roller coaster that runs around the entire city, apparently not violating any building codes. And somehow nothing about that situation garners enough public attention, rumor, news, or physical evidence, because a helicopter and a magnet, for Candace to prove anything to her mother. What I'm saying is that the medium chosen for a piece is one way that the creators signal what to expect and allow. Not that it can't go too far. I've struggled a bit watching Fairy Tail, 100-Year Quest, because it seemed to rely on the medium of anime, a medium where the suspension of disbelief is about as high as it can get, as the quote-unquote setup for the characters simply gaining new abilities or defeating enemies. It lacked genuine setup within the story, and instead used post facto and behind the scenes justifications. This is a shortcoming. Payoff with no setup is displeasing. Similarly, setup with no payoff is displeasing. Clickbait is the simplest example of this. It promises one thing and then never delivers, leaving whoever fell for it similarly displeased and unsatisfied. The two extremes are clearly in the wrong. What about Ghostbusters felt wrong then? There was setup to the payoff, but it still felt off to me. I think the most insightful point that I have is this. Setup does not equal payoff. Ghostbusters Frozen Empire seemed to believe that it did. It seemed to believe that setting up that Nadim met the Ghostbusters looking to make a quick buck meant that he would join their team. It seemed to believe that setting up that Nadim had powers meant that he would master them in the nick of time. It seemed to believe that setting up Melody to have a matchbook for reasons that she didn't even really seem to know meant that she could light it in the nick of time to defeat Garaka. It seemed to believe that because there was setup meant the payoff was therefore justified. Writing as if setup equals payoff is a crutch. The setup has to have a natural place in the story for it to feel, well, natural. Setup works best when it has a legitimate place in the story. Having the kids bouncing around town in their daily search for laughable fun made the rubberization work. Therefore, when it also protected them, it made sense. Setup and payoff exists to make solutions that don't feel magical or forced, that don't feel thrown in to patch a problem that the writers couldn't figure out how to solve, but are instead seamlessly woven into the whole story. To use a physical example, your cat rips your decorative blanket, leaving it with scratches and a giant tear. You want to keep the blanket for its memories that you have associated with it, while also wishing to have it remain a decoration for your house. You have two options for the repair of the blanket. Which do you pick? Why? I, for one, would certainly pick this one. You can look at it and never know that it was a repair job. The same is true for stories. Where there's a plot hole, which would you rather have? A solution that feels plastered on because the writers needed to solve this problem, or something that was created for the same purpose, but fits in with the piece as a whole. Treating setup as if it equals payoff is the former. Creating a piece of work in live action is like having a blanket that is already somewhat detailed. The suspension of disbelief is lower than it would be in a cartoon, and to then slap on a red patch violates the eyes even more. Ghostbusters tried to fit Nadim into the story, making Nadim a character who was looking to sell magical items for a quick buck. But as the story progressed, it felt like Nadim's legitimacy as a character decreased as the story used that small setup to lead to his before unknown fire powers coming up in an interrogation, leading to his power being essential to defeat Garaka. Maybe a simpler way to put it is that his entire arc felt like the writers knew that they needed to set up the character who could lead to Garaka's downfall. But in the end, it felt like watching an inexperienced man attempt to balance himself on a staff. The setup, base, they built the character on wasn't stable enough to hold him. A final point is that there is more believability for any payoff the earlier it is in the story, and if it only progresses them one beat, not past the finish line. It can still feel cheap if done wrong. When a helicopter lands in Doofenshmirtz's building, knocking out all the pharmacists, it still feels wrong, even though it isn't the final solution, and it was arguably loosely set up. However, having the rubberization act as a starting point, a limited time trait that protects them from the first hit of pharmacistification, allows for more believability than if rubberization had simply protected them the entire story. Instead, it protected them, inspired them to create armor, which got them to Doofenshmirtz's home, the source, which allowed them to understand it more and come up with a plan to save Danville. It worked because each setup progressed them to the next payoff, while the next and greater setup and payoffs were being concocted. I'm reminded of a writing concept that often it works for luck to work against the protagonist, but watching good luck solve a problem can often leave the audience feeling cheated. In Phineas and Ferb, Night of the Living Pharmacists, the most unbelievable luck-based were early, while the most grand were planned and intentional. Except, well, the helicopter. Ghostbusters Frozen Empire and Phineas and Ferb, Night of the Living Pharmacists were both fine watches. One, however, left me rolling my eyes at the conveniences granted the protagonists, where the other had me, largely, more engaged, even as I saw the gears turning and watched as the protagonists succeeded. So, why did one work where the other didn't? My answer to you is that one obeyed the rules of setup and payoff, where the other didn't.